Here's a big question. Is the press objective when we cover murders, political assassination, and terror? And can the press cover these events proportionately if politicians are not responding proportionately? Many argue that President Trump has been seizing on instances of crime where the potential assailant is Muslim and neglecting attacks by others. And data shows there's a problem here. Take a recent study which found attacks by people claiming to be Muslim received 449% more coverage on average than those perpetrated by virtually anyone else. I think it's fair to say there is more that we in the press can do to correct this imbalance, while also meeting a challenge of doing that if leaders in the United States suffer from a similar problem. Joining me now to dig in on this is Leila Lalami, an award-winning novelist, university professor, and columnist for The Nation, and Muniba Salim, an assistant communication studies professor at the University of Michigan. Leila, how do you see this problem, and is it getting any worse, better, and how could it get better?
I do think that it's a problem that's getting worse. And I think part of the reason that it's getting worse is that it creates easy stories. When we have a situation where we face an attack by an Islamic terrorist, we have an already built-in story that we can follow. You can hear about sort of the villainy of the Muslim perpetrator and the innocence of his victims. And so it's just very easy to fit those parts in and to create a story around it. And because of that ease, I think it tends to be repeated. Now, no one is, of course, disputing that these attacks are taking place. They are taking place. So it's not just a question of whether they are factual. The problem is that we have an emphasis problem where we are seeing more of an emphasis on these attacks to the exclusion of attacks where other people are victims, including Muslims. So, for example, when you have attacks like the Charleston one in South Carolina, or where you have the attack in Quebec City, or the attack in Colorado Springs. All of these attacks were perpetrated by people of different ethnicities, different belief systems, but we don't get the same coverage.
Right.
We don't see the same coverage in the media. And so I think that that really comes down to a question of ease and emphasis for the media.
Right. And Muniba, the press makes these mistakes in all sorts of ways, not just on this topic. There were periods where shark attacks were highly overcovered. Studies show people then fear shark attacks more when in fact they were not that common. Take a look, for example, this is from the Global Terror Database. When you look at the percent of attacks, 12% a Muslim perpetrator or Muslim foreign-born perpetrator, and then the overwhelming 88% are non-Muslim or unknown.
That's right. So that's what the studies show us, is that compared to actual crime statistics, actual terrorism rates, the media tends to overrepresent Muslims as terrorists, and that's just based on the coverage and the salience of this topic over other topics.
And so, Muniba, I'm also going to read from this the media terror study here. One of the reasons we want to do this discussion, they say they found that the news media do not cover all terror attacks the same way. Rather, they give drastically more coverage to attacks by Muslims, particularly foreign-born Muslims, even though those are far less common than other kinds of terror attacks. One thing that you'll hear from reporters, and I'm not actually endorsing this, but I want to ask you about it as well. A lot of times what reporters do is cover what happens in the wake of an attack. And so when senators in both parties, Muniba, or the president, or even the sort of U.S. security apparatus respond a lot more to one thing, then that's what they're covering, not just the underlying perpetrator.
Yeah, and I think that's accurate. But I think the issue here is that we only hear about Muslims within this context, within the context of terrorism.
Right.
And for American Muslims, that is a severe problem because we don't get to see them in any other kind of context at all. So whether they're doing something positive or even neutral outside of the context of terrorism, that never gets covered by mainstream media. So the general public walks away with only one impression, one story of Muslims, which is in the context of terrorism.
And then, Leila, I want to play for you a statement by Donald Trump. I want to warn you and our viewers just in advance, it's an inaccurate statement. So I'm not playing it for its veracity.
That's not surprising.
I'm not playing it for its veracity, but for this discussion, because he says, and many of his supporters believe this, that it's actually the opposite.
Radical Islamic terrorists are determined to strike our homeland, as they did on 9/11, as they did from Boston to Orlando, to San Bernardino. All over Europe, it's happening. It's gotten to a point where it's not even being reported. And in many cases, the very, very dishonest press doesn't want to report it. They have their reasons, and you understand that.
He is alleging that there is an underreporting of it. All the data we just went through shows it's the opposite. It's, if anything, an overreporting. What do you view as what he's doing there? Do you view it as a type of willfully deceptive propaganda, or what's your take?
Oh, it's absolutely deceptive propaganda, but I think what he's doing is he's sort of preying on this feeling that many people have, which is it's a natural feeling to tend to empathize with victims. So, and if the victim happens to be of the same race or gender or religion, it's easier for a person to put themselves in the shoes of that victim. And so what happens is that when an attack like this happens and we hear about these victims that are non-Muslims, then the non-Muslim viewer will think, well, you know, we need more coverage of this. But if you look at simply the numbers and the facts, you see that the reality is quite the opposite. And I think that part of the reason why the media is not doing as good of a job on this is that in newsrooms themselves, we don't have enough diversity. We don't have enough people who are able to see that these things need to be covered. The attacks that I mentioned earlier, for example, the one in Quebec City, for example, when it first happened, and it was originally thought that perhaps the shooter had been a Muslim who had started shooting in the mosque.
And then you see that total shift of it's almost like a live action experiment. Because we're at the end of our hour, I'm going to pause here, but we talked about some of the problems. I think you both also offered some solution ideas, so I appreciate you both doing that.